We Silugngataanit'sqaq up to Hutna, Melissa Marton. I am FAI's Indigenous Operations and Innovations Director, and I'm zooming in from my homelands of Kodiak Island. I am Shukpiak, born and raised here, and I get to share the screen tonight with two of my favorite ladies, starting with my sister from Cake, Kikwan. You want to introduce yourself, Lagunay?
My name is Lagunay Medicine Crow. I'm Tlingit and Haida. I come from quen, Haida Náay, and here at home in quen. And I get to work at First Alaskans Institute with these really wonderful people who are just here to serve our community, and that's what this work is about. And honored to be able to spend time with you all tonight across the virtual, unceded virtual space of our Native people. So Ganesh Tishawa for joining us. Natasha?
Hi, Natasha Hayden. I am Allutik Supiak from Kodiak, born and raised. I'm so honored to have been invited to join you in this unceded virtual space. Looking forward to our discussion at is it First Alaskans U, Inksa U, tonight, and just so happy to be here. Koyana.
We're so happy you're here with us too. Inksa U is a time for us to learn and share and understand and educate and just be informed about what the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is, what it was when it passed into law 50 years ago. And, from the kind of the basic 101, we were lucky enough to have our board chair, Willie Hensley do a ANCSA at 50 keynote during Elders and Youth. So we played that the other night and just give some background and history on the legislation and what our people were up against. So that's available on our Facebook as well. You could watch that one. It was his keynote followed by some questions and discussion with two young Native leaders, Mishiana Hutcherson, who is an amazing filmmaker and artist in her own right, and also Samuel Haratzika, who was most recently one of our Al Adams fellows out in Senator Sullivan's office, and is now working out there on his own. So that's really exciting. And we had a great discussion with Willie following his presentation. And so tonight, the three of us are going to have a chance to watch a presentation that was also held during Elders and Youth by Kaaháni Rosita Worl, Dr. Rosita Worl, who's the president and CEO of Sea Alaska Heritage Institute. And she did a lunch and learn during Elders and Youth on the impact of blood quantum and its relevancy to who we are back when the legislation was passed, other legislation, where it's used, and then where it is today in terms of our conversation, our identity, and what our Native people are looking forward to in the future as we address big issues like that, or big issues like blood quantum and its current impact on us and what we want to see happen. Her presentation is about an hour, so we're going to watch the video together. We want to invite you to join with us and watch it. This is a live conversation that our whole community is having statewide, not just Alaska Natives either. It's a national conversation as many Native people are talking about what it means to be a Native person, an Indigenous person in this country, and who determines that and what it means for our ways of life. So this is a really critical issue. So many of us are passionate about it. And that's one of the reasons we invited Natasha here, because she is also passionate and knowledgeable about this subject. And so we're going to watch Kaaháni's presentation. We invite you to join us and watch it with us. And then afterwards, we're going to have a discussion following the presentation. So with that, Silugngataanit'sqaq, do you want to get the video started?
So today I'm going to be talking about blood quantum, inclusion or exclusion, and does that lead to survival or extinction? I'm very honored to speak to the Elders and Youth Conference, as you both represent our past and our promise for the future. You embody the greatness of Alaska Native Traditional Society. You also symbolize our prospect for a future that melds our traditional cultural values with our hopes and dreams that we are building a society that respects cultural diversity and brings social justice to our lives. Goodness for allowing me to spend some time with you. In our traditional society, someone who was of an opposite moiety would introduce me. Today, we have identified new protocols since we cannot always be assured that someone of the proper moiety would be present to introduce us. Yeidiklasókw Kaaháni Worl, jak náay, quen náay, kauli hitach ayachat, juskat quen ayachat, klukachadi dachunk ayachat. My Tlingit name is Yeidiklasókw. It's an ancient name that has been handed down through generations of our clan, and its meaning has been lost in antiquity. My ceremonial name is Kaaháni, which means woman who stands in the place of a man. This name recalls an historical event involving intertribal trade, and it speaks to the status of women in our society. The name Kaaháni also reflects the bonds that exist between clans, and in this case, the bonds between the Kaaguantan and the Shungukeidi clans. I am an eagle of the Thunderbird clan and the house lord from the sun in Klukwan in the Chilkat region. I am a grandchild of the Sakai clan. I am entitled to use the eagle, the Thunderbird, and Sun clan crests, and the white bear, killer whale, and shark spirit designs. My identity reflects our ties to our ancestors and to our real and spiritual relationship to our land, environment, and universe. In addition, our clan claims ownership rights to the U.S. Naval military uniform and to the name Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka. Under our law, because Lieutenant Schwatka failed to pay a debt to my great clan grandfather, the Thunderbird clan claimed his name and the naval uniform or semblances of them as liability payments. As we can see by this tribal introduction, Native identity is based on culture, values, traditions, and homeland. Native identity is a set of beliefs and practices held by an interacting community and transferred through millennia of generations. Native identity is based on commitment to ancestral homelands, to one's communities, ceremonies, traditions, and practices that are passed from generation to generation and is presumed to be perpetual. Native determination is based on culture or membership in a tribe or a clan. In our traditional society, Native identity is not tied to blood quantum. Alaska Native peoples have been collectively identified themselves in their Native self-designation or their own native language as the real people. We are the real people. However, in the 1867 Treaty of Cession between the United States and Russia, we were identified as uncivilized tribes. 20 years later, the blood quantum system was introduced into American Indian public policy and law and initially applied to Native Americans under the General Allotment Act of 1887. The twofold purpose of the Allotment Act was 1, to obtain tribal lands for Americans. 2, to civilize and assimilate the Indians by introducing them to the concept of private property that was to be held by individuals rather than the community-based membership of tribes. Under the Allotment Act, some 90 million acres were transferred to the public domain or to non-Native Americans. The concept of blood quantum references the portion of an individual's genetic heritage that is presumed to have come from a Native American. Blood quantum was also used by the federal government as a measure of competency or assimilation. If a Native was less than 50% Native blood, he or she was deemed to be competent, and the BIA was not required to supervise the allottee or to have a legal trust responsibility over the allottee and his or her allotment. The allottee was also free to sell his or her allotment. However, a Native with 50% or more Native blood was viewed as incompetent and required BIA supervision. The federal government began to systematically apply the blood quantum criteria to determine Native identity. It was used as a criteria to determine eligibility to enroll in Native entities or tribes and or to participate in Native programs. Blood quantum is used by the federal government primarily for the purpose of determining eligibility for benefits arising from treaties or federal policy. Blood quantum was also used as a criteria to determine eligibility to enroll into Alaska Native corporations and to participate in Native programs. Existing data clearly shows a historical trend of diminishing Native blood among Native Americans and Alaska Natives. Blood quantum has become an issue of increasing interest and concern in the Native communities. Native societies differ from Western societies in multiple ways. One of the major differences is that Alaska Native societies are group-oriented rather than individually oriented, which is a characteristic of non-Native societies. Tribes or clans rather than individuals owned land. Additionally, Natives also maintain a spiritual relationship with their land, flora, and fauna, which is a foreign concept to Western societies. Laws are a reflection of their society. Thus, in Native societies, laws are developed around group rights. As a member of a tribe or clan, children share in the ownership of land through their membership in their group. Children did not share in the ownership of their land through any inheritance mechanism. Again, this is a characteristic of Western societies. It is often said that Native people begin their speeches with the statement, "We have owned and occupied our homeland since time immemorial." Our history reveals that our ancestors vigilantly guarded our ownership of our lands against all intruders in accordance with their core cultural values. The Russians arrived in Alaska in 1741. Although they did not set foot on Alaska's land, under international law, the Russians were deemed to be the discoverers of Alaska and thereby becoming the owners of Alaska. In their quest for the sea otter furs, the Russians near annihilated the Alutiiq and the Anungan population, as well as the sea otter population. When Russia sold Alaska to the United States, most of the Yupik and Inupiat populations had never seen a Russian or were unaware that Russia had claimed Alaska. When the Russians attempted to usurp native land, the Southeast Alaska Natives went to war with them. When they sold Alaska to the United States, the Southeast Natives met in council to decide whether they should wage war against the United States. They wisely chose not to engage in a military encounter. Our grandparents told the United States official that if they wanted to buy Alaska, then they must buy it from its rightful owners, the Alaska Natives. Native leaders soon learned that they would have to use Western institutions and laws to protect our land ownership and our civil rights. Alaska Natives united under the Alaska Federation of Natives to bring their land claims battle to Congress. The Native leaders did not want to be subject to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They had learned of the tragedy experienced by our tribal brothers and sisters in the lower 48. The BIA controlled reservation lands and land allotments. Young Native men went off to war only to return to find that the government had leased their lands to non-Native ranchers or farmers for 99 years. Reservation lands were often leased to non-Native developers for a fraction of their value. It is a common misconception that corporations were thrust upon Alaska Natives. I want to repeat that. It's a common misconception that corporations were thrust upon Alaska Natives. Granted, corporations were an alien construct to Alaska Natives, but the Native leaders wanted full ownership and control of their lands. When our historical leaders learned that control and ownership of lands was possible if lands were held under fee simple title, which could be held by individuals or corporations, they elected to go with corporations. Ironically, their decision meshed with the goals of the government officials who supported corporations, but for very different reasons. With corporations, land, and a financial settlement, Congress reasoned that assimilation of Alaska Natives into the economic mainstream would be a natural outcome. Suppression of Native cultures and assimilation into the American society remained as a federal Indian policy objectives during the 1960s, and some would say even later than that. ANCSA adopted the 1/4 blood quantum criteria to determine eligibility in Native corporations. The government proposed the 1/4 blood quantum based on previous federal legislations and BIA definitions establishing the criteria for American Indians. The 1/4 Native blood quantum to determine eligibility for Native programs was the common practice of the federal government at the time of the passage of ANCSA. ANCSA also included, in the absence of proof of a minimum blood quantum, citizens who are regarded as Alaska Natives by a Native village or Native group of which the individual claimed to be a member and whose father or mother is, or if deceased was, regarded as Native. ANCSA also excluded the Tsimshians who were enrolled with the Metlakatla Indian community. ANCSA also created a new ethnic classification or identity with the designation of Native or Alaska Native. An Alaska Native is an individual who is a person of 1/4 degree or more American Indian, including Tsimshian Indians not enrolled into the Metlakatla Indian community, Eskimo or Aleut blood, or a combination thereof. The ability to combine blood quantum differs from other Native American tribes that require a one-fourth native blood quantum from a single tribe. It is possible for an individual to be a full-blooded Native American, but not eligible to enroll in his or her mother's or father's tribe, who are enrolled to different tribes. The term Alaska Native arose from a construction needed by the government to have a term that includes all ethno-linguistic and cultural groups in Alaska. As previously noted, Congress viewed ANCSA as a vehicle to assimilate Alaska Natives into Western society with corporations, cash, and private property. Congress authorized an initial enrollment of Alaska Natives who were one-fourth native blood quantum and alive at the time of enrollment. The Native leadership and community rejected Congress's goal and moved to amend ANCSA or to retribalize ANCSA. The restriction on the enrollment of Alaska Natives for a limited generation or for those who were alive in 1971 was a flaw that Alaska Natives did not recognize until the early 1980s. Recall that in Native societies, children are born as members of their tribes with all of the attendant rights of an adult tribal member. Excluding Native children born after 1971 from the ownership of their lands conflicted with Native values and culture and were violations of our traditional values and practices. Once our Alaska Native leaders understood the flaws of ANCSA, they realized that they would need to amend ANCSA. They supported amendments to ANCSA that would allow for the enrollment of Native children born after 1971 into ANCs. However, they did not fully assess the impacts of the one-fourth native blood quantum restriction in their deliberations of ANCSA amendments. Alaska Natives also sought other amendments that they saw as necessary to protect their cultural survival and their ownership of lands. They pursued provisions that would allow ANCs to provide special benefits to elders and to establish land banks. These Native leaders, like their predecessors, did not fight for their land claims for only one generation of Natives to hold title to Native land. They did not consider the implications of dilution of stock, nor did they conceive of land solely as a corporate asset as they fought strenuously to protect their subsistence rights and their lifestyle. They did not think of ANCSA as a path towards assimilation. Rather, they were determined to ensure perpetual ownership of land and the protection of Native culture and cultural survival. They maintained that ANCSA and the proposed amendments represented a native land settlement, was a native land settlement, a native claim. The one-fourth blood quantum requirement has also surfaced as an issue under the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972. The MMPA Alaska Native exemption to hunt marine mammals was set at the one-fourth native blood quantum. In 2016, Sealaska Heritage Institute conducted a study entitled Determination of Native Status under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, led by Dr. Steve Langdon, to determine the effects of MMPA on Alaska Natives. The study reported on the certificates of determination of Indian blood that were issued during a 10-year period to Alaska Natives from 2006 to 2016. The region with the highest number of Alaska Natives who are less than the 1/4 native blood quantum are Seri at 59.3%, followed by Koniag at 59%. The region with the lowest number of Alaska Natives who are less than the 1/4 native blood quantum are Chalista at 7.5%, followed by Nana at 13.1%. By July 2016, of all of the natives who had applied for a CDIB, over 62,000 Alaska Natives were less than the 1/4 native blood quantum and were not eligible to hunt sea mammals, a cultural tradition dating back thousands of years. The study didn't report on the cumulative number of Alaska Natives with less than 1/4 native blood quantum, but only those who had obtained a CDIB during this 10-year period. Thus, we can assume that the number of Alaska Natives with less than the 1/4 native blood quantum is higher. We can also assume that today in 2021, we have a higher number of Alaska Natives who are less than the 1/4 native blood quantum than the 62,000 in 2016. Since I have access to data from Sealaska Corporation to the 1/4 native blood quantum, I would like to share some of that information with you. The Sealaska Board of Directors made the decision to bring a resolution to the shareholders to vote on whether to issue life estate stock to shareholder descendants who were 1/4 native blood quantum or higher. A demographic study authorized by Sealaska projected that by 2004, there would be 21,468 descendants, of which slightly less than half, or 9,910, or 46% would be less than the 1/4 native blood quantum. The study projected an increasing number of individuals who would be less than the 1/4 blood quantum. By 2008, the study projected that 59% of the descendants would be less than the 1/4 native blood quantum, an increase of 13% in 4 years. In 2007, Sealaska shareholders.
What are we doing today?
I've heard somebody else talking.
Oh, you're fine, Kaaháni. It was somebody accidentally that came off mute.
Okay. So in 2007, Sealaska shareholders voted on the resolution to allow for the enrollment of shareholder descendants who were born after 1971 and who were 1/4 Alaska Natives to receive 100 shares of life estate stock. 57.22% voted yes. 41.06% voted no. This was a significant vote in that it was what I have called
So she's going to use the downstairs gym area?
indicator.
Okay.
It was an assimilationist indicator. Okay. What happened was that the vote pitted the communal ownership of property of tribes versus the individual ownership of the American society. The majority of shareholders continued to adhere to the traditional cultural value and beliefs and had rejected the native value of individualism as it applied to native land. In the resolution adopted by the Sealaska shareholders, the 1/4 native blood quantum eligibility requirement to become a shareholder was maintained, although natives who were less than the 1/4 native blood quantum could inherit or be gifted stock. Another source of data on blood quantum can be abstracted from the Sealaska Scholarship Program. In the academic year 2011 to 2012, 38.58% of the scholarship applicants were less than the 1/4 native blood quantum. By 2021, 44% of the scholarship applicants were less than the 1/4 native blood quantum. Again, this is another indicator of the increasing number of Southeast Alaska Natives with less than the 1/4 native blood quantum. No similar data exists for shareholders and shareholder descendants who did not apply for scholarship. However, one can conceivably make the conjecture that the same percent of less than the 1/4 native blood quantum applies to this population in the same age group of 18 to 25 years. A note, and I just want to emphasize that all Sealaska shareholder descendants are eligible for scholarship, Sealaska scholarship, irrespective of their blood quantum. So Sealaska doesn't apply the native blood quantum to its scholarships. It is of interest to note the difference in the 1/4 native blood quantum between those scholarship recipients living in Alaska and those living outside. Here we're contrasting natives living in Alaska with natives living outside of Alaska. In 2020, 25% living outside of Alaska were less than 1/4 native blood quantum. In the same year, 18% living in Alaska were less than the 1/4 native blood quantum. So we could see that outside natives have a higher percent being less than the 1/4 native blood quantum. I understand that some ANCs, such as Sealaska, are considering bringing resolutions to their shareholders to enroll shareholders who are lineal descendants irrespective of the blood quantum. Should shareholders who are lineal descendants of shareholders be allowed to become members of native corporations holding their ancestral land? This is a question that's going to be posed. Such resolutions can be expected to be divisive. They will pit economic values versus cultural values. They will pit individual rights versus group rights. They will pit assimilationist versus cultural values. There can be no doubt that enrolling lineal descendants as shareholders into native corporations will have financial impacts. Enrolling new shareholders will dilute the value of existing shares. Conversely, excluding a growing number of Alaska Natives from owning shares in their native corporations, which provides a tangible tie to ancestral lands, can enhance cultural survival as Native societies. Two Native regional corporations of which I am aware, have already adopted resolutions to allow for the enrollment of descendants who are less than the 1/4 native blood quantum. They include the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation that provides for two different types of stock based on blood quantum. One type of stocks are for those who are 1/4 or more native blood. Another type of stocks are those who are less than the 1/4 native blood quantum. Chalista Corporation, the region with the lowest number of natives who are less than the 1/4 native blood quantum, allows for the lineal enrollment of lineal descendants. The data from the MMPA study, the 2007 Sealaska projection of shareholder descendants, the Sealaska scholarship recipients, clearly points to an increasing number of natives who are less than the 1/4 native blood quantum. And I might emphasize that this is a statewide projection as well. The trend is statewide. If the Sealaska Board of Directors approves of the resolutions to enroll lineal descendants of shareholders, this vote would occur in June of 2022. We can state with certainty the passage of the resolution will dilute the value of existing stock. However, passage of the resolution will ensure that our shareholder descendants and future generations will continue to share in the ownership of our land and the survival of our culture. We have witnessed a resurgence and revitalization in cultural and language teaching and practices in the Alaska Native communities. The assumption can be made that this resurgence will lead to a growing number of Alaska Natives moving to change their 1/4 native blood quantum as a criteria for the enrollment as shareholders in Native corporations and the right to hunt sea mammals. However, this has also been accompanied by a vocal number of shareholders, evident largely on social media, who appear to place preeminence on individualism and would oppose enrolling new shareholders. Our ancestors fought for the protection and ownership of our lands for future generations as they saw land as the underlying foundation of our cultural survival. They sought ways through Western institutions to protect our land ownership. Shareholders across a number of regions voted to enroll their shareholder descendants and to re-tribalize their corporations as Native institutions. They challenged Congress's attempt to assimilate Alaska Natives and successfully sought to enroll shareholder descendants born after 1971. From my perspective, based on the hard data, unless we enroll shareholder descendants who are less than the 1/4 native blood quantum into Native corporations, which hold the tribal assets entrusted to this generation by our ancestors, and unless we amend the MMPA and other governmental programs that provide protections and benefits to Alaska Natives, we will witness the exclusion of a significant number of Natives who are our children, our grandchildren, and those yet to come. The question that must be posed and answered: could the exclusion of Alaska Natives who are less than the 1/4 native blood quantum from enrollment into Native corporations and from hunting marine mammals ultimately lead to our cultural extinction? From my perspective, the application of blood quantum criteria to determine Native identity, eligibility, or membership in Native corporations or entities could lead to a path of ultimate extinction of a tribe or a cultural group. In the long term, in my humble opinion, I would have to answer yes. In closing, I want to congratulate all of our people who fought for the Alaska Native Land Claims Act. The Alaska Native Land Claims Act was the largest Aboriginal land claim settlement in the country. It also set us on a very different path from our tribes in the lower 48, but it also gave us full control and ownership of our land. Our lands cannot be taken by the Bureau of Indian Affairs or leased to non-natives as they historically, the BIA, were able to do to reservation lands. And so I just really want to recognize the leaders, many of them who are no longer with us, but I want to thank them, for their job in trying to protect, Alaska Native cultures. I know that they were not fully aware of all of the impacts that are associated with the Native blood quantum, but I think that our Native leaders and the Native leadership and the Native community today are trying to recognize, to rectify this flaw in the corporations. And I know that Native corporations have been amended multiple times, and I know that as our society continues to evolve and change, that there will be further changes to ANCSA. So I just want to thank you all. Thank you for allowing me to share this time with you.
Yeah, how for letting us watch that video for our team who made sure to pull it from the Elders and Youth feed and make it possible for us to watch the presentation again. There was so much going on at Elders and Youth, and trying to run our whole team trying to run the conference. We had almost 2,000 registered participants for our virtual conference, and the lunch and learn that Kaaháni Dr. Worl presented was on a really important topic. But getting to listen to it again, I heard some things that I don't think I really heard her say the last time. So that was really great to be able to watch it again. And for those of you who may be watching with us on Facebook, this video will be here so you can watch it again. You could share it with people. You could use it for your curriculum. We know that there is a vast need for more Native content, and that's one of the reasons we're doing ANCSA in the first place. One, to celebrate the fact that for the last 50 years, our peoples have been trying to utilize this tool to effectuate the best results on behalf of our communities today and in the future, knowing that there are issues with it. And knowing that we have been the stewards of all of Alaska for 10,000 plus years. And so we're talking about a microsecond of time in our timeline here in our homelands. But because we are the living generations now, it is an ever-present topic. And so I'm grateful for her being willing to share her thoughts about what blood quantum is in terms of its impact on us as Native peoples through these different legal constructs that the federal government has created. And I'm also grateful that we have Silugngataanit'sqaq and Natasha here so we could have a little bit of a conversation, because there was a lot packed into that presentation. And I'm really curious, just I guess to get us started in our conversation, what were your thoughts about the presentation? Did anything really resonate? Did anything really pop out at you that you were like, hey, I want to chew on that for a bit, or was like that an epiphany, or just something that you wish others would know? And I guess I'll start with Silugngataanit'sqaq first, and then we can just jump into the conversation. Or Natasha, did you want to jump in?
I would love to. That's the first time that I've seen that presentation. I was unfortunately not able to view it when it went live. I'm just really, impressed and grateful, and and saddened at the circumstances that we found ourselves in. But the power in having that information and the way that Dr. Worl presented it to me is really necessary. And I think that some of the things, what I wish people were aware of, and I've always kind of been aware of it in kind of the back of my mind, but she did a really good job of just drilling down and making, highlighting things that are really important. She mentioned the Treaty of Cessation, that it's about the land. ANCSA is the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and it's about the land. That Russia wanted to sell the land to the United States. The United States created this thing called blood quantum, and through that construct were able to assign eligibility for being able to own land or to not own land. And for me, and I'm not doing as good of a job as she did when she talked about it, but I think that that's really important, is that, the 90 million acres that were turned over to the federal government, and then, in parallel, creating this blood quantum construct for eligibility and for definition, really kind of just gets to the heart of it. It's not about being native or not. It's about whether or not the decision of how Alaskan Native people were going to be defined, so that they would, whether or not they'd be eligible to hold their land. So I mean, that's just the start of it. So
Well, first of all, I can't believe it's been 5 years since she did that study. I was having conversations with Rosita back then about blood quantum. Her and I were on the subsistence committee together for AFN and have been talking blood quantum for quite a few years. And where did the last 5 years go? Wow. So, and not a whole lot has changed when it comes to the blood quantum front. I think one of the things about Rosita's presentation that really struck me, and it correlates with what Willie said the other night on Wednesday when we watched his keynote, is that our leaders did the best they could at that time. And if they did nothing, we would have nothing. So they didn't understand the implications of what the blood quantum was going to mean to our generation back then. They were just trying to hold on to the land for us and secure our rights. So I don't feel like they get a lot of credit for that, unfortunately, because we are having to live now in this day and age with those implications. And I'm not 1/4 blood, so I'm somebody who, I'm not an original shareholder, even though I meet the age eligibility. I am not able to hunt marine mammals. I can't sew marine mammal skins, and I come from generationally a community and ancestrally that took part in those practices. So the implications of how those blood quantums impact us now and our children, this generation and future generations, is painful. But I don't blame our leaders that fought for ANCSA, because they did the best they could. So
Yeah, goodness, Chish, I was, I was thinking about what they were up against. The grinding of this machine, this system that had perfected the way that it mistreated Native peoples to separate us from our lands, to colonize a people, took a certain mentality that, to think about its impact, is it's just like devastating. That what kind of mentality allowed you to do that to people, to be so strategic as to align the power of government, of business, and of church against the people's very right to live. And we struggle with that paradigm today, that those were the tools used, that were weaponized to get a hold of the land. And that Treaty of Cession, what Russia gave, when you read the Treaty of Cession, what Russia was selling was only what it had any claim to, which was a really small part of what is now called Alaska. So to think about how that whole thing progressed, I was a child when I was sitting with my grandparents in the kitchen, listening to my grandfather, my grandmother, and other elders sitting around talking about how the Russians never had any claim to our homelands and our territory. In fact, when they tried to enter our territory, they were beaten back and could never get into us. And so to see the irony of how the United States took claim over those lands and took claim over our identity and took claim over our spirituality and took claim over our children, this is not coincidental. And so for me, listening to kind of Rosita's perspective on how this all breaks down, I think it provides a really clear distillation of the pathway to how you subjugate a people. And that's one of the things that I was really kind of chewing on, is about the threads that were used. Was there anything else that you folks were thinking about, you know, in terms of either ANCSA or the Marine Mammal Protection Act that you think people really need to be thinking about, or that you've been working on?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely with everything that you said, that all of, when it was clear in our presentation that that was all of those things just didn't happen accidentally. It was intentional with purpose. And I have a ton of thoughts about the blood quantum thing. I'm sorry, Melissa, I don't know how to pronounce your Indigenous name, so I'm just going to call you Melissa. Melissa and I have been friends for years, and her and I, our birthdays are 6 days apart. And I'm hate to reveal our secret, but her and I were born. We just kind of squeaked in under the wire right before ANCSA passed. We're a couple of the youngest old enough Alaskan Native people to have been eligible. And so we've grown up in the age of ANCSA, and my quote unquote blood quantum is just a tiny fraction above what Melissa's is at, and put me at a quarter. And you know what I think is really interesting, that a lot of people in my generation and the younger generation you know, may not have thought about, but I think it is worth putting some consideration into, is that at the time, you know, it was, you know, Alaskan Native people were being assimilated, and there was genocide and cultural genocide, and Alaskan Native people, you know, and sometimes would claim less nativeness to save their lives, or to save their children's lives, so that their children wouldn't be taken away from them. And then the other side of the coin is that the less native you are, quote unquote, in the document, you know, that's how it is determined whether or not you're eligible for certain rights. And it's based on a piece of paper that is documenting, you know, whatever fraction of your nativeness that was determined in 1971. And you know, the conversations that we have in our household, and I really appreciated it, Dr. Worl's talking about her prediction is that there is the potential for genocide. Well, I'm here to tell you, it's not the potential, it's happening. It's not even a slow moving train at this point. I mean, I have 3 children. They are adult age now and reaching adult age. And like Melissa said, she's been involved in the efforts and trying to revise how the eligibility for harvesting marine mammals is determined for years. When people in our region, in our community, in the Koniag, and I know in Sea Alaska, have been working on it for decades. You know, but our children are not, my children are not considered to be Alaskan Native because of that CDIB, and that is, you know, that is extinction. That's a extinction of a culture. And so I work on it. You know, currently there's been I'm trying to think, you know, everything has also been compounded, made more difficult in the age of COVID. I'm extremely grateful to have an opportunity to zoom in and participate in this from, you know, we're from different parts of the state. Lagane, you might even be 1,000 miles away from me. I mean, Alaska's so big. but it's made it, I think it makes it very difficult to be an effective advocate on these, topics that have a very deep impact on our people. But know that just recently I've been working with Koniag, and I forgot to mention when I introduced myself that I'm a tribal council member for the Native Village of Afognak, and I work for my Inksa Village Corporation, which is the Afognak Native Corporation. But so I'm working with Koniag to, to re-up resolution regarding marine mammal harvest eligibility that was submitted to AFN. And I know our Tom Penamera for Koniag has been working with Sea Alaska and EAC and the other regions that Dr. Worl mentioned that are the most impacted already. And it's because that trend is not going to slow down, and so how we identify ourselves as Alaskan Native people needs to be, we need to have autonomy on how we do that. And so you asked me if I had any thoughts. That was a lot, I know. So I apologize if I'm talking too much, but I have it. It's just, we live it and breathe it.
That's what this forum is for. That's why we're having this conversation. We need to
Yeah.
have, and more people need to feel empowered to have it. Well, I don't
Yeah.
like the word empowered. More people just need to have the conversation.
I agree. And so, I mean, here we are, we're 50 years old. I grew up, my father, who was from the village of Afognak, he passed away when I was a teenager, and I didn't have aunties and uncles and grandparents to teach me those traditional ways of life. And so I intentionally, I borrowed a gun from my brother, and I think I borrowed a skiff, or I had a skiff, and the challenges are absurd, because to be a harvester, you have to have, you can't have family member like my husband who's non-native. He can't participate in the hunt, so I have to find brothers and other relatives, which thankfully I was able to do, but to learn it on my own with the intention to be able to be knowledgeable and experienced while advocating to pass those life ways on to my kids, because the way things are right now is that technically they would not be considered to be Alaskan Native, and that's not right. It's not right. And so I guess one of the things that I would, and I have said this to two of my older kids in the last couple of weeks independently, is that we're working on fixing this. Like, we know, and like Melissa said, our elders who fought to get Inksa passed, they did the best they could at the time. This is a part of it that needs to be revised, and it is on us, and to make sure that we don't pass this broken part of that system on to our children and our grandchildren. And so, I'm committed to doing the work. I know Melissa is, I know you are, Lagane, giving us an opportunity to get together and talk about it. My door is open, my phone, these ladies got my number, put it out there. I'm not shy. Give me a call, have a gun, we'll hunt. If you need somebody to take you and to learn with, and I'm not an expert, but I'm doing the best I can.
Since we're calling out the 50-year-old group here, we can't forget that Laganai is in our same age group, although she missed the Inksa cutoff by 7 days.
Oh no.
Yeah. So under 1/4, over 1/4, over, but missed the age range.
That's true. My birthday is December 25th.
Yeah.
And, so I'm going to be 50. I'm as old. We're all as old as this legislation, which to me says, look at how young it is.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, like, we're 50 years old. This is how old that legislation is. And I'm a 50-year-old woman, and I don't know nothing. You know what I mean? Like, I am just now becoming kind of aware of so many things that I didn't understand and I wasn't aware of when I was younger. And because that's just the way life works, you know. And so when I think about like our original shareholders now, you know, and for those who are in the upper years of their life, what a different world they were in, you know, what a different time they were in, and how much more knowledge they have about our human experience and our experience as Native people. When I think about these institutions that have been created by ancestors, and some of them are still with us today, our elders who were around at the time of this, I feel the same way. You know, I know that people were there to hold on to the land and did the best that they could on a door that was closing. And I think about the injustice of that, and it enrages me, you know. But at the same time, I'm enraged at the system, but I'm grateful for our ancestors and people who did what they had to do to even hold on to a small portion of our lands. You know, how large is Alaska? And we were only able to hold on to through ANCSA, which is only one mechanism, and it's only related to land, and it's only certain kinds of land, right? So it's not like all encompassing of the entire state or land holdings. It didn't touch what was already determined as native allotments. It didn't touch the trust land that was already established. You know what I mean? Like, there are things that aren't included in ANCSA. It's not all encompassing, and a lot of people don't understand that either. But, you know, we were able to hold on to 44 million acres of land against or quite frankly, what has essentially been an unstoppable US government. And holding the United States government accountable to its responsibility to Indigenous peoples in this country is absolutely a necessity. And part of that conversation about blood quantum that I really appreciated that Kaaháni was sharing is that this was not new for ANCSA. This was not an invention of the act. This blood quantum question was how the United States government was reducing our ability to hold land and own land. And, you know, one of the other stories that I don't think a lot of people know about, but it's something that we're doing research into with our partners, is this Morningside Institute. That was a, what did they call it back then? A mental health asylum or a sanatorium back in the early days. And they sent people that they had deemed insane or mentally ill to this facility from Alaska down to Portland, Oregon. And, you know, the kinds of people they deemed insane were also that designation for them was a criminal designation. And you know what they did to them? They stripped them of their ownership. So guess how many Alaska Natives were sent away, who were deemed insane and sent away? And we don't know the status of their lands and what became of their lands. Widows, women who were widows were deemed insane. What happened to their ownership of their lands? These are questions that we need answers to, you know? And so there was all kinds of different ways that the United States government was trying to get a hold of our homelands. But we had people there stopping them from taking every last square inch. And now their entities are in our hands. And there are problems. Of course, we've got to talk about these things. And I'm just really grateful that we're at a time where we're starting to think about and talk about these things. And instead of letting federal legislation define who we are saying we as Native people define who we are. And on top of that, we will amend legislation so that it cannot continue to do that to us. And I think that that's what's incredible for us to realize collectively, is that we have that power as Native peoples. The system is always going to err on the side of not us, right? Like, we know that. But we also know that we have a powerful voice in Alaska. And the more that we exercise that voice, it's like any muscle, the stronger it gets. And so when I was thinking about this scheme by the federal government, it's pervasive, it's across so many different things. And try as they might to sever us from our identity, who we are, our ways of life, it hasn't happened yet. So let's talk about that.
All right, we're going strong. One of the other things that I was thinking about that I wanted to just draw attention to, I find it to be very interesting. There's been a shift in the conversation and an awareness that is, I'm going to talk about sea otters right now. So sea otters were hunted to near extinction in the Aleutians in Kodiak and region, and the northern sea otter population. And at some point, and I'm not sure, I can't remember if it was in the 60s or 70s, some sea otters were transplanted back in those areas. And because of the Endangered Species Act that and with the quote unquote Alaska Native exemption, the population has rebounded fairly dramatically recently. But still, the population is only estimated to only be at about, I think it's less than 15% of what the ecosystem can support. But what has happened is that the sea otters are their natural food is shellfish. And so with the rebounding of the sea otter population, what has happened is that has had an impact on shellfish. And it has had an impact on those who are commercial shellfish harvesters, in particularly in Southeast and here in Kodiak as well. And so what has happened is that the people who have benefited from commercial fishing management, which is primarily non-native people, in the Western fisheries management systems that have created opportunities for non-native people to benefit from commercial shellfish fishing or harvesting, are really up in arms about the impact that the sea otters are having on the population. And so now what we've seen in the last couple of years is there's this sort of like statewide awareness and, kind of a groundswell of commercial shellfish harvesters about that are wanting to, look at other ways to manage the sea otter population. So the sea otters stop, hitting the bottom line on their commercial shellfish fishing. And I think this is a perfect example of Laganai, what you're talking about how the system is set up to not benefit us. So here you've got the Marine Mammal Protection Act, protect the endangered species, blood quantum, the Alaska Native exemption, and but still non-native people are looking to adopt other mechanisms to control the population of the species so it doesn't impact their bottom line, rather than working with the Alaska Native people for us to fix this problem when we already have the tools to fix it. We can self-determine who we are as Alaska Native people, and then it will this is my opinion, it could virtually solve that problem. But instead of doing that, it is, the Western management system is looking elsewhere and looking towards themselves because they don't want to have a negative impact on the people who benefit from that. So, but I do think I also view it as a positive because it gives us an opportunity to point out that this is what we're working on when we're able to self-determine our own identity and or how how Alaska Native people are defined, and align that with our own identity as Alaska Native people, then it will benefit everybody in that way. And so yeah, I do think that there's opportunities in that, and seeing the impacts of those policies, what they have on both species and people.
I hope we get to see that change in our lifetime.
We will.
That's what I hope. Yeah. All right. We will.
We will. I told my kid, my son, Melissa, he's going to hold me to it. My 14-year-old teenage boy, he's like, Mom, you better fix that. I said, I'm on it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he'll be mad at me for the rest of my life if I don't fix it.
Well, let's talk about
Exactly.
it. Like, okay, so it's going to happen within our lifetimes easily. We know this. It's going to happen. Let's talk about the Marine Mammal Protection Act first. What is the easiest, shortest distance fix that could happen?
Melissa, you got this.
Easiest, shortest distance fix. There's two fixes. Neither one of them are easy or short, and they're both complicated. One is to amend the act. My understanding of the act, which differs slightly from what I heard Rosita say, is that the 1/4 blood quantum is not actually embedded in the act, but it does reference ANCSA. So if you amend the act, you could add language in there that allows for descendancy or less than 1/4 blood quantum. You could also add language that allows for region-specific determination of who is eligible to hunt. The 1/4 blood quantum is seated within the Fish and Wildlife Service and the NOAA regulation, which are the two federal agencies that are charged with enforcing the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And they cover different species, each federal agencies. So within their regulations, they specifically say, they not only reference ANCSA, but they reference the 1/4 blood quantum. When ANCSA went through its 90s amendments that actually allowed for descendancies within those amendments, the regulations with Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA didn't catch up to those amendments. So their regulations are still based on the original act and the language within the act. So you could change the law or you could change the regulations. Both are highly political processes and complicated, but not impossible.
Well, I think what is interesting about the reason I started with the MMPA and the quote unquote Alaska Native exemption is because of that Alaska Native exemption. It only pertains to Alaska Natives. And so when you think about what is the hardest thing to actually change in federal law, the hardest thing to change in federal law, right? We always tend to think that it's the actual amendment to really huge omnibus kinds of bills or specific bills. And, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, I think it's really interesting that it had a specific carve-out exemption for Alaska Natives. And it makes me think about how difficult an amendment there would actually be. One of the things that I was thinking about is the fact that it is limited in scope. So this wouldn't impact our down south brothers and sisters who might have a stake in it in some way, right? So we know that there wouldn't be a negative connotation for them. And it might actually be something that they would be really willing to help stand with us in solidarity for, because, they too are exerting more and more their food sovereignty and their cultural and spiritual practices through their laws in the same way that we are. And so I don't see that being the highest or hardest bar. Is it hard? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes. But I feel like we're at a different place, and we know how often, for instance, ANCS has been amended. How many times? So many times. So many times, federal legislation is not permanent, carved in stone, and things get amended all the time. And so if we unified as a Native community over these things, and that therein is the highest bar and the hardest bar, right? And then of course, regulations. If we have somebody who understands what it means to be Native and who is committed to strong government-to-government relationships with tribes, the regulations process needs to be addressed immediately. So what's our plan for that? Because we've got a opportunity that's sitting right in front of us. So where are we at on that?
Where we at is we lack, this is the other thing I love about these political processes that involve Alaska Natives. We lack consensus from all Alaska Natives, because how the MMPA and those regulations impact all of the coastal communities across the state is vastly different. Because in Kodiak, we have a clear blood quantum issue and a lack of hunters and the sea otter population getting out of control, like Natasha was saying. They don't have those same obstacles and complications in the up north area of the state. So their drive for wanting that changed is very different. So we have not been able to get consensus, which, that makes sense to me. I mean, when we look at the vast geography of Alaska and the differences between the Inupiaq and the Shukpiaq people in our environment, in what we hunt and how we live, we're extremely different. But the federal government wants consensus among these. That's like getting consensus across the entire United States, right? Let's let Montana and Texas and Florida all come on the same page and agree on something. Yeah, right. But in Alaska, we're expected to do that. We're expected to have consensus among all of our people. It's insane. That's insane.
It is. And, not this redistricting cycle, but the last one after the 2010 census, one of the redistricting board members actually said, to us as Native people, well, if you Natives could come together and unify behind one plan, that would make it a lot easier for us to make a decision. Of course, it would make it easy for you, but you don't require that of any other group. I do not see them asking all of the other groups of people who have an interest in redistricting, which should be any Alaskan, but I didn't see them ask any of them to unify. Why is that? Why is that the bar? Because it divests of us any opportunity and authority and voice and power. It's being used against us.
Yeah. I have found in the last couple of years, I'm going to just highlight again one of the positives of the pandemic and being able to Zoom all over the state and Zoom universe, having an opportunity to network and build relationships with Indigenous people all over the state, all over the nation, all over the world, I think is very beneficial in helping us to educate our brothers and sisters about the dire straits that we're in. I also think that social media, it's almost as good, equal parts good and bad, but the parts that are good are really very good. And again, helping us to network with Indigenous people all over the state, with, Alaska Native arts and crafts, Alaska Native hunters, skin sewers, harvesters, that that is giving us an opportunity to connect with people from other regions so that we can try to dispel some of that concern about, you know, the others from over there is trying to, you know, do something that will harm us. And I think the people who are able to listen in here, you know, the younger people who, you know, we keep hearing Anchorage is the biggest village, and there are people from all over coastal Alaska who have, you know, migrated into some of the urban areas, and, you know, but they have an opportunity to build relationships with people from all over the state, you know, and take it back home to their aunties and their uncles and try to help them understand, you know, that what we need to do is, or what we are doing is going to benefit our people and will benefit our, you know, the 15 somethings all the way to the 50 somethings now. You know, I mean, it's not like it's just the school age kids that we're talking about. We're talking about everybody who is, you know, below a certain age or below a certain threshold, which is going to be everybody very soon. You know.
Well, and you know, to what Silugngataanit'sqaq was saying as well, as, you know, if you think about the other groups of our Alaska Native peoples who have a different process and a different way that they're thinking about protecting their rights to hunt. One of the things that I think is also a Western tool that we constantly get hit with is this notion of a kind of a zero-sum game. And that, you know, if we expand it to this group, then this group is going to get somehow harmed. And so I think about, well, perhaps the solution lies less in all of us having to agree on the exact same solution, and rather all of us agreeing that the solution should not be one size fits all. And that the solution is really should be self-determined by the people themselves. And what does that look like in terms of a regulatory language fix, as well as an amendment to the actual bill?
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's we had those discussions. We had those discussions about region specific language within the regulations and or the act that gave tribes within every region the ability to deem hunters. You know, I believe that is the best fix in reality, because it isn't a one size fits all, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's the path forward, is either amending it's the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations 50, or the MMPA. And it's just like a tiny little change in the language, but to make it so that it's, you know, tribes are making the decisions on who's eligible, and then having them be, so like Melissa mentioned earlier, that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the National Marine Fisheries Service are the agencies that are the managing agencies, and it's species specific, which doesn't make any sense for any region unless you only have one species. And I don't know of any region that only has one species, you know, so it would benefit not only Alaskan Native people, but it would benefit, you know, the federal government in having us manage the marine mammals in our region versus managing, you know, having U.S. Fish and Wildlife, yeah, National Marine Fisheries. We're going to do sea lions over here. We're going to do sea otters over here. And, you know, it's this layers of bureaucracy that just make it that much more onerous and cumbersome and expensive and confusing and all of these other things, versus us having the autonomy to manage the species in our region, you know, by our people, for our people.
Well, and you just made me think about like some of the announcements that came out of the Tribal Nations Conference with the White House this past week. You know, some of those announcements around strengthening strengthening the relationship, right? So there's going to be a tribal advisory council with Secretary Holland, and they're paving a pathway for Native knowledge to be on a co-equal platform with Western science and decision making and policy making, which it's ridiculous that it isn't, but knowing that there's actually people who are trying to put that into the policy now, it gives me hope. And the opportunity for something that we already do so well here, which is compacting, and what would that look like? If you think about our tribal health system and what it was able to do, regionally specific consortiums designing healthcare that meets the needs of their people in their region, right? What would that look like if we had a self-governance compact over managing our marine mammal hunting across our coasts of Alaska? Because one of the things that I appreciate about the tribal health system is that it is autonomous and yet interdependent. They work together collaboratively. They have been empowered through tribally delegated authority coming from the inherent authority of our tribes. And they're coming up with solutions. They're working within a hard system as well in terms of healthcare and healthcare regulations. And they are in the process of making that work for us. Is it perfect? No, of course not. But it's better than what it was when we didn't have it. Oh my gosh, at light years. So much so that the whole world is looking to it as a model for the delivery of healthcare services. We could be that here in Alaska with any wildlife management, if we had the courage to actually do what was really best for the stewardship of this place. And that gets into our ways of life in really profound ways, because that's what stewarded and kept Alaska healthy for thousands of years. Thousands of years. And so what does it mean to us if we get back to the core question that we were talking about, is if you use blood quantum as the gateway for people to actually have connection and relationship with our lands, our waters, and our animals.
Yeah, I would just have to reiterate what Dr. Worl said. It means extinction. I mean, in my own house, it means we have two different, between the difference between me and my kids is I'm Alaskan Native and they're not. And I just don't know. I don't know how anybody, like you were talking about earlier, how a civilization could intentionally do what it did to the indigenous people of this continent and the southern continent with the to meet the objective of stealing the land. So for me that is I feel like my family is evidence of that slow march towards extinction within my own house. So I'm motivated. I am really motivated.
Oh, and that's the thing, right? We know who we are. We determine who we are. And so your children are Native children. They belong to us. And the mechanism that was used to try to sever us from our lands is outdated, should never have been used in the first place, and absolutely needs to change. And all of these barriers that people throw in our way to try to stop that are exactly that. They're barriers, they're impediments. but that doesn't make them right. It just further strengthens the injustice of them. And I'm super excited for us to be able to actually change this, you know, and to do something about it in our lifetime, which is something I know both of you have been working on for so long as well. And I guess to kind of put our final thoughts together, although quite honestly, I could sit here and talk about this all night on a hot Friday night. What else better to do than to talk about these issues with people that you cherish, and your good thinking means so much. But I do know that it's late and we're tired and we need rest. So what are some of your concluding thoughts on the issue of blood quantum before we sign off?
Final thoughts on blood quantum. You know, for me, it's not just the issue with the Marine Mammal Protection Act and our lack of ability to continue our traditions. It's also the emotional impact and the pain and the identity issues that our young people face and that I face as well. And it's taken me the majority of my adult life to come to terms with that. And I have a lot of conversations with young people that struggle with that. This all started for me, this fight to change blood quantum, because when I worked at the culture camp years ago, and I had this one little boy ask me why he couldn't hunt sea otters. Try to explain to a 10-year-old who feels native, who hunts with his dad, who owns his own gun, try to explain to him about blood quantum and why he can't hunt sea otter when there's another kid that can, you know? And first of all, it's really hard to articulate to somebody that's that young, but it's also painful to say, to continue this perpetuation of telling our children they're not enough for whatever reason. You don't look enough native, you don't have enough native blood in you, you don't speak your language, you don't practice your culture, whatever it is. So for me, that's my final thoughts. We need to stop. Society needs to stop telling our children that they're not enough for whatever reason.
I don't think I could say it any better, but really it's those are exactly my thoughts. Same thing. The only other thing that I thought about is, and this is just, adding on to Melissa's comments about not being enough, is that when I am raising my kids to be good people, to be, good people, to be honest, to be giving and generous and hardworking, but then I'm having to teach them, like, this is hard. It's hard for me to talk about my kids not being eligible, and then also talk about how I am passing on these traditions to my kids, because that makes me a criminal, and that makes they will be criminals in the eyes of the federal government if we're not, I'm not going to say if we're not able to make these changes, but the way things are now. And that is, again, the same, it's just more of the same of telling them that they're not enough, and having, it's institutionalized shame and embarrassment. One more thing that is, resulting from the policies of the federal government is that, okay, well, you may be enough, but, or you're not enough. And not only you're not enough, but you're a criminal. And for learning your ways of life and practicing your ways of life. So again, I'm motivated. I'm really motivated. I know Melissa is. I know Lagani, you are. You're amazing, and giving us an opportunity to get together and have this conversation. And I hope that it just gives others a perspective that maybe they hadn't thought of before. Will encourage others to, ask the questions, come to us, let us help you, and figure out a way forward.
Oh, goodness, yeah, I think it's long since been time for us to be able to right this wrong. And, I am, I just want to tell every single one of our Native people that the only people who define who we are as Natives is us. The federal government had a nefarious purpose in creating blood quantum, and they do not get to define who we are as Native people. And the fact that they've used it and have criminalized us from our ways of life continues to just be proof again of how disingenuous the current regime is when it talks about quote unquote managing, because they're not managing, they're harming us. And when our brothers, our sisters, our nieces, our nephews, our aunties, our uncles are criminalized for being Native because of the way that we live. Because without our ways of life, without our ability to be on our lands and waters and be in this really spiritual relationship with our animal relatives, we do cease to exist. And I think that that's what was intended. So it's not like the system's broken. The system's doing what it was meant to. So I just want to tell our Native people that we are the only ones that define who we are. And because this law is unjust, it must change. And I'm really grateful that we have people like you folks who've been working at this for 50 years.
Here's to the next 50.
The next 50. And you know what? There's so many people out there who have had their hands are blistered from doing this work, but their hearts aren't. And I'm grateful for that. And I know that we're going to make some headway on this, and it's essential that we do. So with that, we'll wrap it up. And and just send you guys my love and gratitude for this conversation tonight.
Brianna.
Goodness,
Good night.
sheesh, Laganai.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Night, everybody.